Okay, we've been, the last couple weeks, we've been in the middle of a series that I've been having a lot of fun with. Series called Questions of the Faith. I think the name's pretty self-explanatory. We've been looking at questions that are coming from the outside and threatening the Christian faith. Questions that people ask about Christianity or the Bible or God. Questions that bother Christians, that weigh on Christians' minds. Questions that keep people from ever coming to God because these questions aren't answered in their minds. And I think we've had a lot of fun with it. We looked at things like why God is apparently hidden, why he doesn't just come to earth and prove that he exists. We looked at last week why there's suffering on the earth. It's been really fun. It's something totally different from what we've done normally here at Life Church. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. This morning, we are going to take a step towards the scholarly side of things for just a little bit. Don't be intimidated. It should be really fun. But this is all going to concern a question that really is aimed at the very heart of what Christianity is all about, the very heart of what this whole faith thing is all about. These questions are aimed at the Bible. And it goes something like this. I don't know. Let me know raise your hand if you've heard anything along this vein. Why do you think that you can believe the Bible? Why do you take this book that was written, in the New Testament at least, around 2,000 years ago, and base your whole life around what it says? Or you Christians are always, because I've heard this one, this has been directed at me, you Christians are always quoting the Bible to back up your beliefs. You justify your beliefs with, because the Bible tells me so. You believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he came to save mankind and that he wants a relationship with us just because it says so in the 2,000-year-old book, when in reality, Jesus never even existed outside of the Bible. He doesn't even exist in history. He's just a made-up biblical character. He's a myth. He's a legend. Anyone encounter anything like this? It's becoming more and more common. I've encountered it more and more often. And there's a mentality that's becoming more commonplace in, I guess, secular society that says the Bible is, it's a myth book, it's a legend book, it's a fairy tale, is what Richard Dawkins uses to describe it. It's full of magic and mystery, just like any other fairy tale, and you'd be crazy to believe in it or base your life around it. That's the mentality that's become more and more common. Why? Why is that? I'm going to suggest to you today that it's because of a lack of effort to really look at the Bible as a historical document, that it's become to be viewed as a fairy tale. Because it's really interesting, and what we're going to aim at today is hopefully I'm going to be able to show you that the Bible as a historical document stands on more documentation to verify its accuracy than any other historical document in history. It's really cool. But anyway, as far as the problem goes, think about it like this. Christianity, this thing we're here in the church, is Christianity. It's based on Jesus Christ, right? It's based on Christ coming and saving us and showing us how to live and wanting to walk in relationship with us. And where does everything we know about Jesus Christ come from? The Bible, right? As far as what he taught and what he said and the way we are to live our lives and all that stuff, it comes from the Bible. So if you take the Bible, or the Gospel specifically, and you say, well, these are unreliable, you can't trust these. You can't trust these things. What does that do to Christianity? Well, you've taken out your foundation, right? Really, the Bible is the foundation. This is the thing that we use to establish everything that is true about life, about love, about everything. The Bible is what we use to base our worldview around. And so understanding, this is where that attack is aimed exactly. It's aimed at the Bible, aimed at the foundation of Christianity. So we're going to talk about that today. And again, I'm really pumped because this is like this is the stuff I really get excited about. There's two main things we're going to be talking about today. They're separate, but they're very closely related. And they really, looking at both of them, I think is going to give us a really solid idea of how to begin to answer this problem. And as we've mentioned the last couple weeks, everything you're going to hear up here is going to be just stuff for your own consideration. With stuff like this, every single one of us needs to be wrestling with these issues in our own mind and coming to our own conclusions. So you're going to be hearing my opinion, and you're going to be hearing some things that I think we should consider. But, I'm not necessarily speaking the word of God here. This isn't canon. So hear and consider and come to your own conclusions. But there's two main things we're looking at. And we're going to be looking at how to address the attacks on Jesus Christ as an individual in history. Attacks like that he doesn't exist outside of the Bible, or attacks that say, well, sure, even if he did exist, he was just a really good moral teacher, but he wasn't God. He was a good guy, and he had some good teachings, but he wasn't God. We'll be looking at those, but first, we're going to look at the two most common attacks on the Bible itself. There's a lot of different ways you can attack the Bible, but there's two that are most common, and we're going to be looking at those. And once again, I hope by the time we're done discussing this first part, you guys will see, because I believe this is true, you guys will see that the Bible stands on more documentation to verify its accuracy than any other historical document. And that's really cool, and I'll show you why. So again, there's two main attacks that come against the Bible. Two main attacks that make people say you can't trust this thing as any kind of historical document. The first one concerns what you would call the first time gap. The first time gap. And the first time gap is, and try to follow me here, because I know this is a different side of thinking about things, but just try to pay attention. I'll explain. The first time gap refers to the period of time between when Jesus lived and taught and the first written account of his life that we have. You know what that means? So Jesus died around 30 to 33 AD, right? And so when is the first written account we have of his life? The attack says, okay, look, you don't have any accounts for hundreds and hundreds of years after Christ lived. You don't know what he really said. You don't know what he really did. He probably never even said that he was God. That was probably just embellishment. Overall, he probably never did any miracles. He probably was just a teacher, a guy. And over time, myth grew into legend and what have you, until he became, oh, look at this. Jesus Christ is the Son of God, because we say so after 300 years of embellishment and myth. This is what we're talking about in the first time gap. Jesus lived here. When is the first account you have of his life? You don't have any reliable accounts of Christ's teaching. Christ didn't write any books, so you don't know what he really taught. The New Testament wasn't written until hundreds of years after Christ died and after every witness to his actions was buried, and therefore it's full of myth and full of legend. This is that first attack, and this is probably the most common one you'll see as far as textual criticism goes. And again, so just to reiterate, this is a claim that we don't have any reliable account of what Christ actually said. If he existed, we have no idea what he really did or what he really said, because it was hundreds of years before we have a first account of anything that he did or said. Anything could have been changed. Anything could have been added. Myth and embellishment. To briefly address this, because it's really cool how easily this is addressed. I love this. But if you look at the New Testament and you study the New Testament, because again, everything in the New Testament was written after Christ's death, and the Gospels are a record of what Christ did and said, and then you've got all the epistles, letters to churches that describe Christ as the Son of God and the things he said and did. All evidence suggests that the entire New Testament, every book in the New Testament was written before 95 AD at the latest. You know what that means? If Christ died in 30 to 33 AD, and the entire New Testament was written before 95 AD, you've got a gap of less than 70 years. Because you've got Paul and Peter and James who were all martyred, like on record, in the mid-60s. So obviously any books they wrote had to be before that, right? All the evidence you look at, it is extremely upfront that the Gospels were written before 95 AD. Some of the books were written as early as the late 40s AD. What you have is in some cases, a gap of less than 20 years after Christ died, we have accounts of what he did. Accounts of what he did in life. Now, I'll tell you why that's significant. I'll give an example here. If if after we finish this sermon, we finish the service today, one of you, let's say my brother Canaan, let's say Canaan went out after the service and he wrote on Facebook. He said, "You guys, you won't believe it. After Nate finished speaking, he burst into flame." It was incredible. It was amazing. It was like fireworks. It was glowing, and then he was just gone. Can you believe it, guys? Amazing. Now, the rest of you seeing this on Facebook, what would you do? Didn't happen like that. I was there, and it didn't happen, right? You guys are eyewitnesses to the thing. He's making that up, right? Well, of course, that's just how it happens. Somebody makes something up, another eyewitness says no, and there are like 100 other people with me who can also verify that that did not happen, right? What is significant about the fact that the entire New Testament was written before 95 AD, and most of the books before that, most of the Gospels much before that, if it's full of accounts that didn't happen, if it's full of embellishment and myth, things that, if it is something other than what Christ actually did and said, the people who actually saw what Christ did and said would have still been alive, and they would have written against it. This is how things worked. It's how things work right now. But what you have in the case of the New Testament is it stands up to the test. Is that my voice or is that thunder? Man. Lord. What is so significant about this whole thing is the fact that the New Testament and everything written in it stands up to the witness of eyewitnesses. That's incredible. That is really incredible. I really want you guys to get a picture of how amazing this is. We have an historical account. Have a seat. God really wants you to understand how significant this is. So pretend there's okay, we got some words, NEC, getting there. It is extremely significant. In the world of textual criticism, it is extremely significant to have a historical document that stands up perfectly to the witness of people who actually saw what happened. That doesn't happen. I know we think, okay, there's a New Testament and that's our Bible and that's another thing. That's just our Bible and that's for faith things. It's not for real things. What I'm telling you is the Bible, the gospel accounts stand up as a historical document. You hear what I'm saying here? You get what I'm saying? The Bible, the Gospels of what Jesus Christ did on his time on earth stand up as historically accurate according to the eyewitnesses who saw what he did, according to the people who have no reason to lie about what he did, the Roman side of things and the Jewish side of things. Really interesting. So that first criticism that we don't have any accounts of what Jesus did for hundreds of years after he died isn't true. We have accounts as recently as like 18 years after he died, which is incredible. So that first attack just doesn't stand up at all. The second most common attack comes in the form of what you call the second time gap. And I wish we had our words up here. Hopefully we'll get them soon. The second time gap. This second time gap refers to the period of time between when the actual New Testament was written, when all the letters and the Gospels were written, here we go, and when we have our oldest copy of it. Because when you're talking about historical documents, you never have the original copy. They're always lost in history, but you have our copies. So the way this works is, again, it's called textual criticism. The way this works is you have your oldest copy, and then you have however many numbers of that oldest copy that verify, the same thing. So let's say we've got a historical document about the history of Egypt, and we have our oldest copy at like 200 AD, and we have 5 copies that verify this is what it is. That's how it works. Okay, we're pretty certain we have a good history of Egypt. There's 5 copies that all say the same thing. The criticism here against the Bible, against the gospel specifically, is, well, okay, you don't have the original, and it was retranslated and recopied so many times over the last 2,000 years that it's impossible to have a trustworthy copy. The attack goes like this: the Bibles you read are nothing like what was originally written. They've been retranslated so many times and recopied so many times, you can't have any certainty whatsoever that what you're reading is what was really in the original Bible. That's the attack, and what is so cool about this one too is it's so easy. Like the moment you look at any of the evidence here, it is so easy just to blow this argument right out of the water. And I love the way this works, because to me it is a witness to the fact that God has preserved the Bible for mankind. Anyway, I'm getting excited. I've got to focus. So again, the way this works is you look at your oldest copy and you look at how many of those copies you have. You look at how, okay, it was written in this time and we have our oldest copy in this time, so that's how many years have passed. And the longer amount of time has passed, the less certain you have what was originally in the text. And the less copies you have of that original text, the less certain you can be that you have an accurate historical document. So let's look at some examples of other historical documents that are held up as being accurate. How many of you have heard of the book Caesar's Gallic Wars? This is an historical document that is used to record the time, or to record this period in history, okay? And this is considered solid. The original text was written in 50 BC. Our oldest manuscript of this text, our oldest copy, is from 900 AD. Now, I'm no mathematician, but how many years is that between the original writing and our oldest copy? You've almost a millennia. 950 years. And we have 10 copies of this that all say the same thing from our 900 AD. And so we said this is historically accurate. 950 years have passed, but this passes our examination. Let's try another one. We've all heard of Aristotle, right? Great philosopher. Aristotle first wrote his philosophies in 384 to 322 BC, in that time period. This is when he wrote his stuff, the stuff that we study these days. The oldest copy that we have is from 1100 AD. That's 1,400 years. It's a long time. And we have 5 copies. 5 ancient manuscripts that verify that this is what it was saying over, again, 1,400 years. But this is the stuff we study. This is the stuff we said. This is what Aristotle taught. Now examine the Bible and consider Caesar's Gallic Wars and Aristotle. The New Testament was written between 48 and 95 AD. All the books and stuff were written during that time frame. The oldest manuscript we have is from 200 AD, the oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament. What's the time difference there? You have about 100 to 150 years compared to 900 years, 950 years with Caesar's Gallic Wars, 1,400 years with the writings of Aristotle, and we have 14,000 copies of the New Testament from this time frame. You have 8,000 in Greek, 1,000 in Old Syriac, 5,000 in Latin. In the world of textual criticism, no historical document in the world ever comes even close to the documentation we have for the New Testament. Is that not incredible? Really? If you don't see why that's incredible, I hope you can understand someday, because this is amazing. This is really, really amazing that we have our scriptures hold up as historical documents. The things we read about Jesus Christ hold up as historical documents better than other historical documents do. John Warwick Montgomery makes a statement, and this is a scholar who's into textual criticism. He says, "To be skeptical of the resultant texts of the New Testament is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient periods are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament, which being interpreted means if you are to nitpick at the New Testament and say you can't trust it, you've got to throw out every book that we use to establish what was going on at this period in history, because none of them hold up as well as the New Testament. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I'll tell you why I believe that the Bible was so well, this kind of evidence is so well, it's lasted so well over the years. I really believe that God was preserving this stuff for us, preserving the scriptures for us today and Christians yesterday and those tomorrow as something that we can trust as an account. Because again, the case of the New Testament, it doesn't happen in the world of textual criticism. It just doesn't. And it's amazing. So that was fun. And again, I know for some of you that was probably in an area of thinking that you're just not used to going. But as a summary, just know our scriptures and our New Testament, the accounts that we read of Jesus Christ hold up in the face of any attack scholars can throw at it. And that's really cool. It's really, really cool. So let's transition really quickly to looking at attacks on the person of Jesus Christ. Attacks about whether he actually existed or whether he actually claimed to be God or did the things that he said he did. And here's what's cool about this. We don't have to we don't have to come to the point where we say, well, he's only in the Bible, and I just believe that he's in the Bible because the Bible tells me he's in the Bible. We actually have references to Jesus in ancient Jewish writings and ancient Roman writings. I'll give you an example. To give you a picture, the Jews were for a long time waiting for a Savior, waiting for a Messiah sent from God to redeem the Jewish nation. And Jesus didn't really come in the way they expected him to come. They were expecting a mighty, like a physical nation to be established, a physical kingdom, and Jesus came to establish a different kind of kingdom. So they rejected him for the most part. Most of the Jews rejected him, especially the Jewish religious leaders. So they didn't like him and ended up killing him. That's why he died. That's why he was crucified. The Jewish leaders killed him. We have Jewish writings. And again, the Jews are anti-Jesus for the most part. We have Jewish writings, ancient Jewish rabbinical writings, in a book called the Talmud. You can look it up. It's the Jewish history of their own history, like what was going on with the Jewish people, written by the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, the Talmud. You have Jewish writings that talk about Jesus during this time. And again, they believed him to be a heretic and a wicked man who claimed to be God, and he was evil, and they killed him for his crimes. This is what they write about him. They say that Jesus of Nazareth was a transgressor in Israel who practiced magic, who scorned the words of the wise, who led people astray. He was put to death on Passover Eve for heresy and misleading people. And it names 5 of his disciples, and it mentions that his disciples did the same kind of magic that Jesus did, that they healed the sick in his name. Now, this is a Jewish history, okay? This is not a Christian history. This is a Jewish history about a group of people who did not like Jesus. They had no reason to say good things or misleading things about him. They say that this was a man who was evil, he was against our religion. This was a man who practiced magic, it said. Jewish history records that Jesus did things, not only that he existed and he was there, but that he did things that they couldn't explain. They assumed it must have been a demon. It records his disciples are historical figures, and they did things that they cannot explain. That's really cool. How many of you have heard of Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian? He wrote all about the first century A.D. He lived in the first century A.D. He wrote about Herod and John the Baptist, how Herod put John the Baptist to death. He wrote about James, the brother of Jesus, being martyred. And he wrote this about Jesus. And again, this is a Jewish historian of the Pharisee sect who has no reason to lie about this stuff. This is not a Christian. He writes, "And there arose about this time a man named Jesus, who was a wise man, if indeed we should call him a man. For he was a doer of marvelous deeds, a teacher of men who received the truth with pleasure. He led away many Jews and also many Greeks. It says, and when Pilate had condemned him to the cross on his impeachment by the chief men among us, those who had loved him at first did not cease, for he appeared to them on the third day alive again, and divine prophets having spoken these and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And even now, the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not yet died out. Here you have an outsider history looking in at this guy named Jesus and this movement called Christianity and going, something was different about that. Here was a man who was a wise man, and his teachings were incredible, and I don't know if I can even call him a man because he did some incredible things, and people listened to him. This is not a Christian speaking. This is not revisionist history. This is a Jew of the Pharisee sect recording the history of what happened to the Jewish people. That's really amazing. They uncovered a letter from a Gentile father to his son from this time period, from the 30 AD period. This is a Gentile father. This is just a guy, okay? He's just like a Roman guy. He's writing to his son about the things going on in his life and things going on around him. And he says this, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. I'll interpret that for you. The Jews, there was a large movement of them that considered Jesus their king, and the Gentiles had heard about this, and yet they killed him. He says it was not long after that their kingdom was abolished. He's referring to the fact that that Jerusalem was destroyed pretty soon after Jesus' death because they tried to rise up against the Roman Empire. And he says, and this wise King Jesus, he didn't die for good because he lived on in the teachings that he left in the movement of the Christian people, the movement of the way, it was called. This is, again, a total outsider, just a guy writing to his son about this stuff, talking about Jesus Christ, talking about the movement called Christianity that started up. Jesus Christ is not a myth. He's a well-attested historical figure, a guy who lived in history. And that's really cool. I love it when, wow. I love it when faith stuff and real life stuff mix in a way you can't really deny. Because I think we have a way of going, here's real life and here's Christianity. And there's like the Bible, and then there's like history, and those are different things. I love it when they cross over and we can't deny them. So here's what's crazy about Jesus Christ, the uniqueness of the character named Jesus. For the outsider looking in, looking at this historical figure, what you have is got to be one of the most unique individuals in history, probably the most unique individual in history. Let's do this real quick. I'll have to get through this quickly because of time, but imagine that there was a guy, let's call him George. Imagine that a guy named George lived about 2,000 years ago, okay, in some part of the world. He was a guy that history records, he was a historical figure, and you study about him in school. Imagine that George claimed to be God. And now you're thinking, okay, no big deal. I've met a lot of people who claim to be God. Imagine that George claimed to be God, but that people actually believed him. And that a lot of people believed him. And that 2,000 years later, people still believe that George is God. Well, suddenly it's a pretty interesting historical figure, isn't it? Imagine not only that, but it's recorded that George did incredible things that you couldn't explain. George did miracles. George did things that people who didn't like him could only describe as magic. That's a very unique historical individual, isn't it? Imagine that George was maybe the most brilliant teacher the earth has ever seen. That even people who didn't believe that George was really God or did miracles looked to the teachings of George and said, these are incredible moral teachings. That people who didn't believe he was God still try to live the way George taught to live. What you'd have as a historical figure is there is no person in history more unique than this guy named George. Now let's get rid of the name George because that's just silly. Let's replace the name Jesus Christ. Because what you have in the character of Jesus Christ, the historical individual of Jesus Christ, is a guy who claimed to be God and who people believed that he was God. And people still believe that he was God. A lot of people. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people, a billion people believe that he's God. This is a guy who historically did miracles, incredible things. This is a guy whose teachings are still held up by people all over the place as being incredible moral teachings. There is no historical individual like Jesus Christ. And for the person on the outside looking in, I just can't see how you can't look at Jesus Christ and go, there's something incredible about this guy in history. I feel like you just got to shut your eyes and go, blah, 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 I don't want to hear it. Because it's really hard not to look at Jesus and say, there's got to be something more there. And here's the thing. People try to say, okay, Jesus Christ, he was a good guy, and I respect his teaching, and I'll live the way he taught us to live. He was a great moral teacher, but he wasn't God, and I don't believe he did miracles or any of that stuff. The problem is, and what's so cool about it is, Jesus has not left that option open to anybody. Looking at his life, you can't just say he was a great moral teacher. You've got three options. C.S. Lewis pointed this out. Looking at the life of Jesus, there's only three things you can decide. You can decide that he is a liar, that he lied about being God. You can decide that he was a lunatic, he was a raving megalomaniac, an insane person who believed that he was God but wasn't. Or you can believe that he was Lord and that his claims were true. So let's examine really briefly each of these as we wrap up here, because this is really neat. You can't say he's a good moral teacher. You can't say he's a good moral teacher and that he's a liar, because if he is a liar, well, first of all, he's a hypocrite, because he's doing things, living his life in such a way that directly contradicts the things that he teaches. Second of all, he has to be what you'd call the most wicked man in history. Because if he was lying about being God and wasn't, and led people to follow him with their lives, led people to die for him, you've got an incredibly wicked man. You've got somebody who is a fool, an absolute idiot, because he died for his lie. He went willingly to his death for his lie. And why would he lie exactly? People lie to gain something, right? Was it to gain power, as most people would say? He was offered power a whole lot of time, many times. People said, we are ready. We're ready, Jesus, to rise up with you and take down the Roman Empire. And he said, I didn't come for that. Him being a liar really doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So let's try lunatic. Let's say that Christ is a raving madman. The problem is, we've got all his teachings. And you read his teachings, and what you find there is an incredible amount of depth and sanity, for lack of a better word. I don't think anybody can read the things Christ said and did and say, well, that guy was totally nuts. His teachings make sense. They're highly intelligent. They're extremely sane. It doesn't make sense that he would be a lunatic. And so if him being a liar doesn't make sense and him being a lunatic does not make sense, what can you do with the historical individual of Jesus Christ? You can either close your eyes and say, I don't want to hear it. Or you can look at him and say, he must be telling the truth. He must be Lord. That was the coolest thing I've ever done. So this was a whole step in a completely different direction for many of you. Some areas a lot of you have never really thought about too much. But stuff like this is so worth considering. So worth considering for your own mind, because having an understanding of these things strengthens your faith and your love of the Bible and your love of Christ and your appreciation for how much God has preserved for us through the years. And it can also give you the ability to witness to people who have blocks in their way and will say, I can't accept God, I can't accept Christianity before these questions are answered. It's so worth thinking about. And what's so cool is we have a Bible that stands up better than any secular document as being historically accurate. And we have a God, we have a Jesus, a Savior, who is not only attested in other historical documents, but stands as somebody who must be telling the truth, who must be God, who must be Lord. So we're gonna wrap up here. We're gonna have our band come up, but if any of you have more questions, or this is only scraping the surface, because this is a very in-depth discussion. There's so much to talk about. But if any of you want to continue or have questions, feel free to come to me afterwards. I love talking about this stuff. We're going to be in the coming weeks, Lord willing, we're going to be starting up a class time once per week, probably on a Thursday night. We're going to meet in that room back there that most of you probably didn't know existed. And we're going to be going in depth with stuff like this. Have a little more time, a little more freedom in a classroom environment. But I just encourage all of you to continue to wrestle with this stuff in your mind, coming to conclusions and considering this kind of thing, because it's so worth considering. It's so worth having a firm belief that our scriptures are solid and worth believing. It's so worth looking at the character of Christ and having your faith being increased by looking at his historical accuracy and the things that he did and things that he said. And we're just really privileged to have a God that cares enough about us to preserve this kind of thing.